No comments. No comments. I cannot answer it at this time.
What was Richard's motive?
To kill.
That's it?
To kill.
It was a time of unrelenting fear when the shadows cast by the setting sun seemed to grow longer and darker. An eerie sense of unease settled over the city, as if something sinister lurked just out of sight. At first, the attacks seemed random and unrelated, but as the nights wore on, a chilling pattern began to emerge. All the victims had one thing in common. They had been alone when the darkness around them. The city held its collective breath as the unknown assailant continued to strike, always under the cover of darkness. The media dubbed the perpetrator the Night Stalker, a name that seemed to capture the essence of the terror that gripped the city. Let's delve into the shocking true story of the Night Stalker and uncover the terrifying details of a reign of terror that would haunt a city forever. It was a sweltering summer in 1984, and a sense of unease settled over the sun-kissed streets of California. It was as if the very fabric of society had been torn apart, allowing a monster to emerge from the shadows. His name was Richard Ramirez, but the world knew him as the Night Stalker. Ramirez's descent into darkness began in his troubled childhood. His father's brutal abuse left emotional scars and even caused brain damage. By the tender age of 10, Ramirez had turned to drugs to escape the pain. His fascination with the macabre grew as he spent time with his older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who suffered from schizophrenia and PTSD. As Ramirez entered his teenage years, his interest in Satanism and the occult deepened. He became increasingly withdrawn, and his behavior grew more erratic. By the time he left Texas for California at 22, Ramirez was hooked on cocaine. To feed his addiction, he turned to burglary, which soon escalated into a murderous rampage. The Night Stalker's killing spree lasted for 14 terrifying months, leaving a trail of blood and devastation in its wake. His methods were brutal and varied. He used handguns, knives, machetes, and even a claw hammer to claim his victims. He punched, pistol-whipped, and strangled them, often taking pleasure in degrading and humiliating them. The Night Stalker's legacy was of terror and tragedy, a reminder of the darkest depths of human depravity. His story served as a chilling warning of the horrors that could unfold when the darkest aspects of human nature were allowed to flourish. As the sun set over the desert landscape of El Paso, Texas, a sense of foreboding settled over the Ramirez household. It was there that Richard Ramirez, the future Night Stalker, spent his formative years, shaped by the dark influences of his childhood. Born on 29th February 1960, Richard was the youngest of 5 children to Mexican immigrants Mercedes Munoz and Julian Tapia Ramirez. His father, a railway laborer, struggled with a violent temper, fueled by his addiction to alcohol. The Ramirez home was a battleground where fear and uncertainty reigned supreme. As Richard navigated the challenges of childhood, he found solace in substance abuse, starting to smoke marijuana and drink alcohol at the tender age of 10. This early exposure to substances set him on a path of destruction, one that would ultimately lead him down a dark and sinister road. It was during this tumultuous period that Richard met his older cousin, Miguel Angel Mike Valles. Mike, a decorated Green Beret, had returned from the Vietnam War with a sense of pride and a penchant for storytelling. As Richard listened with rapt attention, Mike shared tales of his wartime experiences, planting seeds of darkness that would eventually germinate into unspeakable evil. As the years passed, Richard's fascination with the macabre grew, fueled by Mike's twisted narratives. He became increasingly withdrawn, his behavior growing more erratic with each passing day. The stage was set for a descent into madness, one that would leave a trail of devastation in its wake. As Richard Ramirez navigated the turbulent waters of his adolescence, he found himself increasingly drawn to the darker aspects of life. His fascination with the macabre grew, fueled by his cousin Mike's twisted tales of war and violence. At 14, Richard began experimenting with LSD, and his frequent use of the drug only served to intensify his bond with Mike. The two of them spent hours discussing their shared interests in Satanism and the occult, and Richard found himself becoming increasingly enthralled by the dark and sinister world that Mike had introduced him to. As Richard entered his teenage years, he began to experience a growing sense of disillusionment with the world around him. He became increasingly withdrawn, and his behavior grew more erratic. It was as if he was struggling to find his place in the world, and he was willing to explore even the darkest corners of human experience to do so. Richard's job at a local Holiday Inn gave him a sense of freedom and anonymity, and he soon found himself using his master key to rob sleeping patrons. It was a brazen and reckless act, and one that seemed to hint at the darker impulses that were driving Richard's behavior. But it was not until Richard's cousin Mike committed a horrific crime that the true extent of Richard's darkness became clear. Mike's actions had a profound impact on Richard and seemed to mark a turning point in his descent into madness. As the years passed, Richard's fascination with the dark side only intensified. He began to use cocaine and started committing theft and burglaries to feed his addiction. He lived a nomadic existence, drifting between San Francisco and Los Angeles County, always staying one step ahead of the law. As Richard Ramirez's dark obsession with evil continued to intensify, his actions became increasingly sinister and calculating. It was as if he had become a master of manipulation, always staying one step ahead of his victims and the law. The events of April 10, 1984, proved to be a pivotal moment in Ramirez's descent into madness. On that fateful day, he committed a heinous crime that would go undetected for years to come. The victim was a young girl named Mei Leung, who had been searching for a lost item in the basement of her apartment building. Ramirez's cunning and deception led her to follow him into the basement, where he subjected her to a brutal and horrific attack. The investigation into May's disappearance was ongoing, but the police were still in the dark about the identity of her killer. Meanwhile, Ramirez continued to roam the streets of California, driven by an insatiable hunger for destruction and chaos.
Well, he took a woman in her 60s and stomped her to death with his foot, leaving an imprint of a shoe on the side of her face. From that to just executing somebody upon walking into a room after he entered a house. He strangled, he used a ligature, he used a tire iron on a young girl.
As the summer of 1984 wore on, the people of California were about to experience a new level of terror. On 28 June 1984, a gruesome discovery was made in the apartment of 79-year-old Jenny Vinco. The elderly woman had been found brutally murdered, with multiple stab wounds to the head, neck, and chest. The police were shocked by the brutality of the crime, and they knew they were dealing with a highly calculating and ruthless killer. As the investigation into Jenny's murder got underway, the police discovered a crucial piece of evidence that would eventually lead them to the killer. But for now, Ramirez remained at large, free to continue his reign of terror and claim more innocent lives. Richard Ramirez's dark obsession with evil continued to intensify, and his actions became increasingly sinister and calculating. The people of California lived in fear, wondering when and where he would strike next. On 17 March 1985, Ramirez attacked 22-year-old Maria Hernandez outside her home in Rosemead. He shot her in the face with a .22 caliber handgun, but she miraculously survived. Hernandez played dead until Ramirez left the scene, but the horror was far from over. Inside the house, her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Yoshi Okazaki, was shot and killed by Ramirez. The attack was swift and merciless, leaving Okazaki dead and Hernandez shaken to her core. Within an hour of the Rosemead attack, Ramirez pulled 30-year-old Tsai Lian Veronica Yu out of her car in Monterey Park, shot her twice with a .22 caliber handgun, and fled. The two murders, and an attempted third in a single day, attracted extensive coverage from news media, who dubbed the attacker the walk-in killer and the Valley Intruder. The people of California were on high alert, wondering when Ramirez would strike again. Before we dive into the more details of these heinous crimes, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. 1 week later, Ramirez claimed his next victim, 64-year-old Vincent Charles Zazara, who was killed in his sleep with a gunshot to the head. Zazara's wife, 44-year-old Maxine Lavinia Zazara, was awakened by the gunshot and attempted to defend herself, but Ramirez was too powerful and he shot her 3 times, killing her. The police were closing in on Ramirez, but he remained at large, free to continue his reign of terror. On April 14, 1985, he returned to Monterey Park and entered the home of 66-year-old Bill Doy and his disabled wife, 56-year-old Lillian Doy. Ramirez shot Bill in the face with a .22 semi-automatic pistol and beat him into unconsciousness. As Richard Ramirez's dark obsession with evil continued to intensify, his actions became increasingly sinister and calculating. The people of California lived in fear, wondering when and where he would strike next. The events of 29 May 1985 proved to be a pivotal moment in Ramirez's reign of terror. On that fateful day, he attacked 83-year-old Mabel Marbell and her disabled sister, 81-year-old Florence Nettie Lang. The brutality of the attack was shocking, and it seemed to mark a new level of intensity in Ramirez's crimes. As the investigation into the Bell sisters' attack got underway, the police discovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that linked Ramirez to a series of brutal crimes. The people of California were on high alert, wondering when Ramirez would strike again. The next day, Ramirez drove to Burbank and sneaked into the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle. At gunpoint, he bound Kyle and her 11-year-old son with handcuffs before ransacking the house. The fate of Kyle and her son hung in the balance as Ramirez continued his rampage. As the days passed, Ramirez's actions became increasingly erratic and violent. On the night of July 2, 1985, he drove to Arcadia and randomly selected the house of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon, a widowed grandmother. The people of California held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The attack on Cannon was particularly disturbing, and it seemed to mark a new level of intensity in Ramirez's crimes. 3 nights later, he broke into a home in Sierra Madre and attacked 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron as she slept in her bedroom. The fate of Bennett hung in the balance as Ramirez continued his rampage. As the police closed in on Ramirez, he continued to evade capture, always staying one step ahead of his pursuers.
Today, the search for California's Night Stalker continues.
I'm afraid for everybody, elderly, young, everybody.
On July 7th, 1985, he burgled the home of 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson in Monterey Park. The people of California were living in fear, wondering when Ramirez would be caught and brought to justice. As Richard Ramirez's dark obsession with evil continued to intensify, his actions became increasingly sinister and calculating. The people of California lived in fear, wondering when and where he would strike next. The events of July 20th, 1985, proved to be a pivotal moment in Ramirez's reign of terror. On that fateful day, he attacked 66-year-old Layla Conniding and her husband, 68-year-old Maxon Conniding. Ramirez burst into the sleeping couple's bedroom and brutally attacked them with a machete before killing them with shots to the head from a .22 caliber handgun. The brutality of the attack was shocking, and it seemed to mark a new level of intensity in Ramirez's crimes. As the investigation into the Nidings murder got underway, the police discovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that linked Ramirez to a series of brutal crimes. The people of California were on high alert, wondering when Ramirez would strike again. On the 6th of August, 1985, he drove to Northridge and broke into the home of 30-year-old Chris Peterson and Virginia Peterson, aged 27. Ramirez crept into the bedroom, startling Virginia and shooting her in the face with a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The attack on the Petersons was particularly disturbing, and it seemed to mark a new level of intensity in Ramirez's crimes. 2 nights later, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Diamond Bar and chose the home of Sakina Abawath, aged 27, and her husband, 31-year-old Elias Abawath. Ramirez instantly killed the sleeping Elias with a shot to the head from a .25 caliber handgun. The fate of Sakina and her 3-year-old son hung in the balance as Ramirez continued his rampage. He subjected Sakina to a brutal and terrifying ordeal, demanding that she reveal the locations of the family's valuables. As the police closed in on Ramirez, he continued to evade capture, always staying one step ahead of his pursuers. On 18 August 1985, he entered the home of 66-year-old Peter Pan and 62-year-old Barbara Pan in San Francisco. Ramirez shot the sleeping Peter in the temple with a .25 caliber handgun, killing him instantly. The attack on the Pans was particularly disturbing, and it seemed to mark a new level of intensity in Ramirez's crimes. Ramirez subjected Barbara to a brutal and terrifying ordeal, leaving her for dead. At the crime scene, Ramirez left a sinister signature, scrawling a pentagram and the phrase, "Jack the Knife," on the bedroom wall. As the investigation into the Night Stalker's crimes continued, detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo were hot on the trail of a crucial lead.
He had no empathy, no feelings, nothing. He wanted to be known as the greatest serial killer that ever lived.
They had discovered a unique shoe print at one of the crime scenes, and they were determined to track down the owner of those shoes. The detectives contacted the manufacturer of the shoes and were able to retrieve the soles. Upon examining the shoes, they discovered that only 6 pairs of that particular model existed in the men's size 11.5. 5 of those pairs had been shipped to locations in Arizona, but 1 pair had been shipped to a shoe store in Los Angeles. It was a breakthrough in the case, and the detectives knew they were getting close to catching the Night Stalker. But just as they were making progress, San Francisco's mayor, Dianne Feinstein, held a televised press conference and revealed crucial details about the case, including the caliber of the gun used by the Night Stalker. The detectives were furious, knowing that the Night Stalker would be watching the news coverage and would now have the opportunity to destroy crucial forensic evidence. And indeed, Ramirez did just that, dropping his trainers over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge that very night. Ramirez remained in the area for a few more days before heading back to the Los Angeles area. The detectives were still hot on his trail, but Ramirez always seemed to be one step ahead. On 24th August 1985, Ramirez traveled to Mission Viejo, a quiet suburb 76 miles south of Los Angeles. He arrived at the home of 45-year-old James Romero Jr., who had just returned from a family vacation to Mexico. But Ramirez's plans were foiled when 13-year-old James Romero III spotted him lurking around the house. Ramirez fled the scene, and James quickly contacted the police with a detailed description of the car and a partial license plate number. The police were now closer than ever to catching the Night Stalker. But Ramirez was not ready to give up yet. He broke into the home of 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his fiancée, 29-year-old Inez Erickson, through a back door. Ramirez entered the sleeping couple's bedroom and awakened Carnes when he cocked his .25 caliber handgun. The fate of Carnes and Erickson hung in the balance as Ramirez continued his rampage. He shot Carnes 3 times in the head before turning his attention to Erickson. Ramirez identified himself as the Night Stalker and forced Erickson to swear she loved Satan as he beat her with his fists and bound her with neckties from the closet. As the police closed in on Ramirez, he continued to evade capture, always staying 1 step ahead of his pursuers. But for how much longer? The people of California were living in fear, wondering when the Night Stalker would be caught and brought to justice. As the investigation into the Night Stalker's crimes continued, the police were getting closer to catching their suspect. A detailed description of the assailant provided by Inez Erickson, who had miraculously survived her ordeal, proved to be a crucial piece of evidence. The police also obtained a cast of the Night Stalker's footprint from the Romero house, which would later prove to be a vital piece of evidence. Meanwhile, the stolen Toyota was found abandoned on August 28th in Koreatown, Los Angeles. The police were able to retrieve a single fingerprint from the rearview mirror, despite the Night Stalker's careful efforts to wipe the car clean of his prints. The fingerprint was positively identified as belonging to Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter from Texas with a long rap sheet. The identification of Ramirez's print was described as a near miracle due to the recently installed system used to identify him. As the police closed in on Ramirez, they decided to release a mugshot of him from a 1984 arrest for auto theft to the media. At the police press conference, a stern warning was issued to the Night Stalker. "We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide." The people of California held their breath as they waited for the Night Stalker's next move. But little did they know, Ramirez's reign of terror was about to come to an abrupt end. The police were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before justice would be served. As the police closed in on Richard Ramirez, he was unaware that his reign of terror was about to come to an abrupt end. On 30 August 1985, Ramirez took a bus to Tucson, Arizona to visit his brother, oblivious to the fact that he had become the lead story in virtually every major newspaper and television news program across California. After failing to meet his brother, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles early on the morning of 31st August. He walked past police officers who were staking out the bus terminal, hoping to catch the killer should he attempt to flee on an outbound bus. Ramirez then entered a convenience store in East Los Angeles, where he noticed a group of elderly Hispanic women fearfully identifying him as El Matador. He ran across the Santa Ana freeway, desperate to escape the law. But his attempt to carjack an unlocked Ford Mustang was thwarted by angry residents Faustino Piñon and Jose Burguin. Ramirez's desperation grew as he attempted to take car keys from Angelina de la Torre. But her husband, Manuel de la Torre, witnessed the attempt and struck Ramirez over the head with a fence post. A group of over 10 residents, including Jose Burgoyne's sons, formed and chased Ramirez down Hubbard Street in Boyle Heights. The residents soon restrained Ramirez and beat him relentlessly. At around 8 a.m., police were called over a disturbance in the area with few other details. Police quickly arrived on Hubbard Street and took a severely beaten Ramirez into custody. The Night Stalker's reign of terror had finally come to an end. As Richard Ramirez sat in his prison cell, awaiting his trial, the people of California were still reeling from the terror he had unleashed upon them.
A serial killer comes about by circumstances and like a recipe: poverty, drugs, child abuse. These things, contribute to a person, to a person's frustration and anger, and at some point in life, he explodes.
Trial. On 22nd July 1988, jury selection for Ramirez's trial began. At his first court appearance, he raised a hand with a pentagram drawn on it and yelled, "Hail Satan!" The courtroom was shocked by his brazen display, and it was clear that Ramirez was determined to make a spectacle of his trial.
Richard told me he needed to associate gruesome violence with sex in order to be completely satisfied. He also told me that he had to violently fantasize about his victims before he could go away sexually gratified.
They are desires, whereas if I didn't give in to them.
As the trial progressed, it became clear that Ramirez was a master manipulator. On 3 August 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that some jail employees had overheard Ramirez planning to shoot the prosecutor with a gun, which he intended to have smuggled into the courtroom. The courtroom was immediately equipped with a metal detector, and intensive searches were conducted on everyone entering. But despite the heightened security, the trial was not without its dramatic moments. On the 14th of August, the trial was interrupted when one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletree, failed to appear in court. Later that day, she was found shot to death in her apartment. The jury was terrified, wondering if Ramirez had somehow orchestrated the event from behind bars. However, it was ultimately determined that Ramirez was not responsible for Singletary's death. She had been shot and killed by her boyfriend, who later committed suicide with the same weapon in a hotel. The alternate juror who replaced Singletary was too frightened to return to her home. On 20 September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of all 43 charges against him: 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The courtroom erupted in cheers as the verdict was read out. During the penalty phase of the trial on November 7, 1989, Ramirez was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. As he was led away in handcuffs, he turned to reporters and said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." The trial had cost $1.8 million, making it the most expensive murder trial in California's history at the time. As Richard Ramirez awaited his trial, a surprising encounter took place. He reportedly met actor Sean Penn, who was also jailed at the time for reckless driving and assault. Penn claimed to have received a letter from Ramirez, to which he responded with a stern message, telling Ramirez he had no sympathy and hoped he would die in the gas chamber. As the trial approached, Ramirez's notoriety continued to grow. He began to attract a following of fans who were fascinated by his notorious crimes. By the time of his trial, he was receiving letters and visits from admirers. One such fan was Doreen Leoy, who wrote Ramirez nearly 75 letters during his incarceration. In 1988, Ramirez proposed to Leoy, and on October 3, 1996, they were married in California's San Quentin State Prison. As the years passed, Ramirez's marriage to Leoy endured, despite his impending death sentence. Leoy had stated that she would commit suicide when Ramirez was executed, but by the time of his death in 2013, Ramirez was engaged to a 23-year-old writer. The appeals process was lengthy and complex, with Ramirez's fate hanging in the balance. On July 31, 2006, his first round of state appeals ended unsuccessfully when the California Supreme Court upheld his convictions and death sentence. Despite additional appeals pending, Ramirez's fate seemed all but sealed. The years ticked by, and Ramirez's health began to decline. On July 6, 2013, Richard Ramirez died of complications secondary to B-cell lymphoma at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California. His death marked the end of a notorious chapter in California's history, bringing closure to the families of his victims and the people of California who had lived in fear of the Night Stalker. This notorious case serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist within human nature. The heinous crimes, which terrorized a community in the 1980s, had a lasting impact on the families of the victims and the community at large. The perpetrator's eventual capture, trial, and sentencing brought closure to many, but the memories of those brutal crimes will never be forgotten. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more true crime stories. Share your thoughts on such a heinous crime. Your opinion matters. Like, share, and comment below. Don't forget to hit the notification bell for updates.